Hi, everyone. I'm just going to wait just a minute at the max to let everybody file in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Tanner or Shayla, if one of you could continue to admit people as they come in, that would be great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today for our first webinar of 2026. My name is Kate Compton-Gore, and I'm the training coordinator at the National NAGPRA Program. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel. For those of you who regularly attend these webinars, you will notice that we have transitioned to Teams. So this is our first webinar using this platform, hoping everything goes smoothly. But we've transitioned to Teams, and recordings of all past webinars have also been moved to the YouTube channel, the NAGPRA YouTube channel. After this presentation, we will turn on the question and answer where you may submit questions for live responses. So that should be similar to the Zoom webinars. Our next webinar is May 15th, and that is what is and what is not repatriation. I'll post a link for that soon. I'm also looking into other sorts of trainings and workshops and other ideas I have for these upcoming live webinars, so stay tuned for more information. Today I have our NAGPRA fellows, Tanner Barney and Shayla Charlie, here today to help assist me with the Q&A, among other members of our team. Audrey Andrews has completed her fellowship and is the Southern Ute TIPO, so we know that she's doing well. Melanie O'Brien, the National NAGPRA Program Manager, and other members of the team will also be available to assist with the Q&A. Today's webinar is Simplifying NAGPRA, and I created this webinar to provide you all with information to help prevent overcomplicating the process and decrease confusion and misunderstanding. The topics presented today are based on the most common questions and assistance requests we receive. The NAGPRA process does not have to be difficult, confusing, or fraught with misunderstanding. I implore you all to think about how you go about compliance with the law, and instead of thinking of it as a standalone requirement, to incorporate it into your day-to-day activities and relationships. NAGPRA is about gathering info, consulting, and repatriating. Sitting with you all here today, I wanted to discuss, excuse me. I do acknowledge that the process can feel complicated and challenging at times, but the goal is to repatriate, so focus on the basics and move through the process. Kay Matena with the association recently said that transparency and humility are always a good approach. I want to address the language that I will be using in today's webinar, which follows the regulatory language. However, we acknowledge that some terms may be offensive and other culturally sensitive terms may be preferred by tribes, communities, and individuals, and I advise you to discuss preferred language during consultation. Okay, I'm going to start my presentation. Okay. I'm sure someone will tell me if you can't see the presentation. Today's webinar will focus on ways to simplify the NAGPRA process. Many of you here today have worked with me one-on-one or a number of other members of our staff, and we remain available to answer questions via email, which is NAGPRA_info@nps.gov. In a presentation by Melanie O'Brien at the Association on American Indian Affairs Repatriation Conference in February, she mentioned, as did staff of the association during their wonderful NAGPRA training, that if you have trouble, go back to the regulations. That is the single most important thing you can do to decrease confusing and misunderstanding. Read the regulations. I'll mention that the association is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to protecting Native American sovereignty, preserving culture, and educating youth, and they are a great resource. Another great resource is the NAGPRA Community of Practice, where all those engaged with NAGPRA come together. I, like Melanie and other members of our staff, have the regs printed on our desk and along with a bookmark of them electronically so we can access them in different formats. And even with the expertise that we have, we look to the regulations daily. Keep in mind, our website has tools and resources that I will go over today that will aid you and guide you through the process. And don't forget to search the preambles or the final rule. The long comment and answer section has a lot of wonderful information. The updated regulations provide several ways to simplify the NAGPRA process. Today, I'll speak on the following topics, as this is where many of our questions are found. Deference to Indigenous knowledge, the step-by-step roadmap, the difference between a summary and an inventory, information on competing claims or requests and timelines. So I've identified these three core principles to simplifying NAGPRA. The first one is don't overcomplicate it. If the process feels complicated, stop and check to see whether you're following the regulations or adding unnecessary steps or information. Second, focus on what is required now. Don't worry about what might happen. Concentrate on the current step that you're on and the requirements there. Too often, we receive questions about future steps and hypothetical problems, and this can lead to undue stress and delay. And third, follow these steps. We can't emphasize this enough. Pull out the regulations, know whether you're in 10.9 for cultural items or 10.10 for ancestors, and read through step by step. And I'll remind you all that 10.9 relates to the section in the regulations that covers other cultural items, including unassociated funerary items, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. And 10.10 relates to ancestral human remains and associated funerary objects. So I really liked this slide. I actually borrowed it from a friend that it's to gather NAGPRA is about gathering information, consulting, and repatriating. So it's about relationships. And I mentioned that rather than thinking about it as a task, really form these relationships. Consultation is ongoing. It's not a single one-time task. Transparency builds trust, and tribes are experts. So many of you here today, we are all experts in what we do. Tribes and Indigenous nations are also experts in their knowledge and their items and ancestors. The law is simpler than people think. The confusion comes from institutional habits, not the statute. So these are just some of the tools that we have on our website. And what I've done is I've included here in the parentheses where on the website they're located. So the steps to repatriation document is a guidance document. And if you look, it's under law and policy guidance document. I think a lot of people don't go and utilize these because they look similar to the templates perhaps. And if you're going to the templates page, make sure you're also going to the guidance page. So we also have templates for repatriation of human remains and associated funerary objects, templates for repatriation of other cultural items, additional guidance documents that I just mentioned. And don't forget, our website has databases for tracking compliance and published notices. And again, I've listed where in the website these are all located. So I want to talk about the deference to traditional knowledge. The final rule addresses the use of Native American traditional knowledge by museums and federal agencies during the determination process. Congress intended for Native American traditional knowledge to be considered when determining cultural affiliation or identifying cultural items. The definitions of funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony all rely on information that may only be available to or shared by lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and NHOs. Consultation is how an Indian tribe or NHO shares the information needed to identify a cultural item. In cases where there is no other information available, Native American traditional knowledge alone may identify a cultural item. We often get asked about how a museum or institution can prove an item is sacred or cultural patrimony. when a tribe makes a request for repatriation, and we advise that museum to read the definitions, evaluate the request. A tribe does not have to prove an item is a cultural item. Rather, the museum must determine if the request satisfies the criteria or not, and must explain why. And remember, specific details do not need to be shared about the cultural item. If a tribe or NHO asserts an item as a cultural item, by making a request for a specific type of object, that is the tribe asserting that it is a cultural item. The tribe does not need to provide information beyond identifying the type. So here is the definition. It's a lot of words on the page, but I really wanted to put this in here, and I'm going to read it because I think this is really important regarding or helping to ease confusion around the definition. So Native American traditional knowledge is knowledge, philosophies, beliefs, traditions, skills, and practices that are developed, embedded, and often safeguarded by Native Americans. Native American traditional knowledge contextualizes relationships between and among people, the places they inhabit, and the broader world around them, covering a wide variety of information, including, but not limited to, cultural, ecological, religious, scientific, societal, spiritual, and technical knowledge. Native American traditional knowledge may be, but it is not required to be, developed, sustained, and passed through time, often forming part of a cultural or spiritual identity. So when you're reading this definition, it's rooted in this larger concept of indigenous ways of knowing. And those ways of knowing might not be understood to the larger group, and that's okay. These indigenous ways of knowing will change between individual, between tribe and nation. Attempts to cover the wide variety of terminology related to this concept while remaining consistent with NAGPRA. That was really the goal with defining this. Different terminology is used by and among Native American people that incorporates this concept. And Native American traditional knowledge is inclusive of other terms. So Native American traditional knowledge is not new. This is not a new concept to lineal descendants, Native American tribes, or NHOs. And any difficulty understanding this definition can be resolved through adequate consultation. Now, you might not, as somebody who's consulting with the tribe, might not feel they're getting the information they need from the tribe, but the tribe doesn't have to share that. But you can resolve, at least understand how that knowledge is being used. Our intent in defining this type of information is to ensure that Native American traditional knowledge is considered alongside scientific and historical information. It's not below or above, it has equal weight. Congress intended for Native American traditional knowledge to be considered when determining cultural affiliation or identifying cultural items. In cases where there is no other information, again, Native American traditional knowledge alone may identify a cultural item, and it is considered expert opinion. Okay, so moving on to the steps. We're moving out of traditional knowledge. I could spend an entire webinar discussing traditional knowledge. If you do have questions about that, please put them in the Q&A. But I want to move on to this. This is a guidance document. I've shown this before. This step-by-step roadmap is actually my favorite resource. It's very helpful for people who are stuck or having issues or perhaps new. Or even if you're a seasoned NAGPRA person and you go back to this step-by-step, it's really a wonderful quick guide. Keep in mind, though, it does not contain all the information you will need, but it will help orient you as to which step you were on. If any of you felt fear when I said read the regulations, then I recommend starting with this roadmap. So because we've gone into this in detail, you can visit those webinars on our YouTube channel, but I will go over a few pieces that I do like about this that are helpful. So for example, this is the roadmap for 10.9 for repatriation of cultural items. And you can see there are 7 steps. The first step, in compile a summary, you can see the basic information that's needed. And again, the regulations have more detail. But if you look at the bottom, there is the exclamation point in the triangle, and that's found in 3 of these steps. We get asked often what documents need to be sent to National NAGPRA, and so this helps remind you where you are in the process and what we need to receive. So for a summary, you compile a summary, and then you initiate consultation and you consult. And then you move through the steps. So in the roadmap for 10.10 for repatriation of human remains or associated funerary objects, there are 8 steps. It's a similar process, and you can see again where the exclamation points show you what you need to do or when you need to send to National NAGPRA. There is one additional step in here, and where that is in a summary. So the first step in an inventory, and I will be going into some of this in a few minutes, but an itemized list is needed to initiate consultation. Once you consult, you complete the inventory that is based on the result of consultation. And so people will often mix up the term itemized list and inventory and summary. So today I really want to help solidify that. And again, you move through the steps. So a summary versus an inventory. There continues to be confusion on this topic. A museum under NAGPRA may include a museum or another institution, including a university, a college, medical examiner, or any agency that receives federal funds or has received federal funds since 1990. A summary follows 10.9 in the regulations and is a written description of a holding or collection that may contain a Native American cultural item. Cultural items are unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. And a summary is based on available information about the institution and the collections, and consultation is after the summary is compiled. So a summary is a general narrative and can be as simple as a paragraph. It does not need to contain individual counts. For example, a museum may use lots or at least. So our museum has at least 10,000 biology items from throughout the United States that were collected by a specific collector between the 1890s and the 1920s. There you've identified that collection. Or our collection has 500 ceramic vessels in our anthropology collection from the southwest of the United States from a specific collector, and you can name the time period. But it's based on the information that you have. It's really important to understand your collections to be able to write a general summary. A summary is not meant to have been updated. They were due in 1993, and there are places in the regulations where, and I will show you, where you are required to update your summary, but that's only in specific examples. So a summary is if you think of it as being broad enough that it will encompass and incorporate your entire collection. So even with this broad description, tribes know what items may be of interest. So by saying you have 10,000 biology items, in your collection, or you have a collection of taxidermy, then a Native nation can say, oh, okay, we are interested in that because we have sacred items that have been found in these collections before. The museum does not have to know what items are cultural items. In some cases, you may have information that you think you have a cultural item, but you don't need to know. Consultation will help, and tribes will identify them then. So what if your museum has only paleontological collections? Again, this is where it is important to know your collections and your institution and any available information on collecting history and anything that could be helpful to discuss. Having a collection that you do not believe has a cultural item is not considered exempt or non-NAGPRA. And I just want to say that again. Having a collection that you do not believe has a cultural item does not mean it's exempt or non-NAGPRA. If a museum chooses not to submit a summary, that means the museum is asserting that they do not have any Native American cultural items. And we have seen the use of the term exempt, and again, that's not correct. Museums and federal agencies have discretion on which holdings or collections they include in the summary. So I found this language in the regulations, and again, I look at the preambles regularly because pretty much every question I have, I can find an answer in the preambles. So I'm sure all of you can as well, but I'm going to read this. So when a museum or federal agency decides to exclude a holding or collection from a summary or inventory, it is deciding that the Act and these regulations are not applicable to that holding or collection. If that holding or collection contains human remains or cultural items, the museum or federal agency has failed to comply and could be subject to civil penalties or other legal action. So if a museum or federal agency knows that a certain collection or holding does not contain cultural items, the holding or collection would not need to be included in the summary. So for example, a collection excavated from a historic era ranch that does not contain any Native American items would not need to be included on a summary. In one example that was provided in the comment section of the regulations as well, an archaeological collection was excluded from a summary because the museum had assumed that it did not contain any cultural items. However, archival information about the person who made the collection clearly identifies that the collector removed objects from a funerary context. So that is, again, a really good example of why it's important to know your collection's history, the provenance information, and utilizing the information that you have in your records at your institution. Okay, there is a lot on this slide, but it is meant to be, it's a screenshot. I've used this in a previous webinar, but I want to show you, it's a screenshot of our template for cultural items. There is a lot of information, but I want to go over kind of the different ways people can write a summary. We get asked a lot about how to write a summary or what needs to be in a summary. And really, you can choose what you put in a summary. So in the arrows, I've indicated the different types of summary. So on the first page, under where it says 3 examples of summary formats, example one is a summary from an institution that did have more information on their items and believed that they had identified tribes that could be potentially culturally affiliated. And so that was based on the information that they had. Now, if you move over to the next page where the other 2 red or reddish orange arrows are, these are different summaries where the museums had less information and knowledge about their collection, but enough, again, to write a summary. It lists the types of items they have, the areas of the country of the United States where they're from, collector information, how the museum acquired their collections. And so when I say you can write this in an afternoon and it can be a paragraph, this is what we mean. And the idea is to get the information out, so to initiate consultation with tribes and then let the tribes tell you if you have any items that are cultural. Okay, so an inventory. Different than a summary, an inventory includes Native American human remains and associated funerary objects. It is considered a more detailed item by item listing, but the counts can still be at least. And I do see this miscommunication all the time, that you don't have to have exact counts of the ancestors. If you know you have at least one, you can say you have at least one. If you have a box, and you don't know how many ancestors are inside, but you know there are Native American human remains, you can say you have at least one and you put it on the list. If the tag says there are 3 individuals, you can use that. And what happens is when you create this list, you go item by item with the information that you have. And once you start consulting, tribes will tell you, we would like you to open all the boxes. We would like you to divide them by age and sex for reburial. So there are different ways that you can get this information. So even though the list is more detailed, it does not require or need additional research, inventory, counting. It utilizes the available information. You do not need an exact count. And again, I really want to be, you can say at least. During consultation, additional details and decision-making will help guide your steps. There is often confusion around the language between the itemized list and an inventory. So pay attention to the language in the regulations. Your itemized list is just that. It's a list based on the available information. Once you initiate consultation and consult, and you finalize that itemized list, that's when it becomes your inventory that you submit to National NAGPRA and to tribes. And that's where you also get your cultural affiliation determination. So, and this example, I'll give you an example. We have on our guidance documents, there are lots of wonderful examples that Melanie wrote with the team about this. So if you still have questions, please go look there. But if you have a box of Native American human remains and you don't know how many people are in the box, don't hire an osteologist. You don't need a bioarchaeologist. If you know the box contains Native American ancestors, you can start with that information. And the same goes for associated funerary objects. You can use lots or at least one for the items, and that's sufficient to begin consultation. So this is a picture, this is a screenshot from our inventory template. So not the itemized list, this is the inventory template. We also have a template for itemized lists. So what I wanted to show you today is there are three types of inventory styles. There's a spreadsheet, there's a table, you can do a descriptive paragraph, more of the paragraph style. But these three blue-gray arrows are pointing to cultural affiliation determination. If you look at the template for itemized list, it's exactly the same. It just does not have the cultural affiliation determination. So that's really the only difference. Now, there's a lot more happening in the background. We have a template for consultation, for record keeping of your consultation determinations. And there's a lot that's obviously happened between initiating consultation and consulting. But this is really what you're getting to, is the cultural affiliation determination. And you don't have to, some of the templates have information that is required for the Federal Register, and we explain that in the templates. Most of these templates are more of a guide and they help, but you can use your own format as long as you put in the required information. Okay, so determining cultural affiliation, competing claims and requests. So I want to spend a few minutes. We've been getting a lot of questions about competing requests. And so I do want to go over this a little bit. We can spend more time in the Q&A, and this is something that I may return to in the future, again, for additional training. So, and this is pulled from the regulations. When there are competing claims for disposition or competing requests for repatriation of human remains or cultural items, a museum, federal agency, or DHHL must determine the Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization with the closest cultural affiliation. In support of a competing claim or request, each claimant or requester may provide information to show by a preponderance of the evidence that it has stronger relationship of shared group identity to the human remains, or cultural items. So competing requests, the information for evaluating competing requests. So the claim is part of a competing claim is part of the disposition process. And the competing requests are part of the repatriation process. So today I'm going to focus on the competing requests and under 10.9, step 7. So read through this step very carefully. It will provide a lot of information, but the areas where I see a lot of questions come in are timelines. So you have, if you do receive a competing request, museum or institution has 14 days to send written notification to each requester with required information. And so go ahead and look and make sure that you're following exactly what you need to include. You need to evaluate that request as you did in step 4 under 10.9D. So you evaluate the criteria in the same way you're evaluating the request, and the requester at this point can provide additional evidence. And then you have 180 days to make a determination. So if you have one request, you have 90 days. If you get a competing request, that essentially stops the 90-day clock and starts the 180-day clock. It is important that you reach out to the competing request and ask or confirm that it is a competing request and not a joint, because sometimes those tribes will say, or NHOs will say, no, actually, we'd like to do a joint. So definitely start that conversation. And the idea of 180 days is to give the museum or institution enough time to make that determination. At the end of that 180-day period, the museum or institution must make a determination and continue to move through. It's a little bit different for the disposition process for federal agencies. And again, I'm not going to go into that today, but we definitely can answer questions on that. So a lot on this slide, but I did want to briefly talk about timelines. So I'll let you look at this for a moment. But this is for both 10.9 and 10.10. So these are found in the regulations in separate areas. So I'm going to go through this, but then I also want to revisit the 2029 deadline because, again, there's confusion about the difference. So we'll start with the summary at the top. If a museum or federal agency acquires possession or control of an unassociated funerary item, object, sacred object, or object of cultural patrimony, that institution has 6 months to submit a summary. So, and the same goes if it locates previously lost or unknown. 6 months to submit a summary. Now, again, what am I trying to say? If when you're putting your summary together, that is where the paragraph comes in handy, which is why 6 months is enough time. You won't need more time. There is not an extension for a summary because the summary is meant to be this general description. Again, focus on the possession or control piece. Possession or control is different from custody. So perhaps you have items in your collection that you are not in possession or control of. Maybe a federal agency has possession or control and you have custody. Then it would be a little different if then the federal agency would need to update the summary, or excuse me, not update the summary, submit a new summary. So we don't really do updates to the summary. If you feel like your collection has changed so much that the original summary cannot encompass what the collections are, then that is when a summary must be submitted. So moving to an inventory, it's if you acquire possession or control of human remains or associated funerary objects, it's 2 years, or you locate lost or previously unknown, it's also 2 years. Receiving federal funds for the first time is 5 years. But if you see here, there's a lot of confusion around this 2 years. So the 2 years is kind of rolling. There's not a specific deadline. It's that when you acquire possession or control, or you locate ancestors that you did not know were previously in your institution, you have a 2-year deadline. The 5-year deadline, the 2029 deadline, is for museums and institutions that included ancestors in an inventory but were never published in a notice. So again, ancestors that were previously included in an inventory that was submitted, a notice of inventory completion, but were, back up, don't write that down. Ancestors that were included in an inventory but were never published in a notice of inventory completion would have the 2029 deadline. For everything else, it's a 2-year deadline. So I want to make sure that you all do understand that. So some takeaways from today's webinar is I really want you to think about that conflict is not as common as people fear. During the recent webinar for the Indigenous Collections Care Guide, this was stated, and I really wanted to reiterate this. It's really not as common as people fear. And so pick up the phone, send the email, build the relationships, build the trust, and don't wait to start the conversation. And then go back to the first slide, or the third slide, where I discussed kind of those 3 main ways that I see people having trouble, and really just focus on where you are. But try to, I hope that you all can find ways of moving through this to simplify the process and make it easier for everyone. So it is 10:33, and I have, as always, talked so fast. It's gone by very quickly. But I want to stop sharing and start to answer some questions. And so let's see, I'm going to go to the Q&A. All right, so we have a couple of questions in here. Now I am, Tanner Barney and Shayla Charlie are going to be assisting me with this. I'm not sure if you can actually up choose these, but let's see. The first question is, I recently joined a museum with a collection that has unassociated collections, likely collected on BLM lands. Beyond including it on our summary and ensuring duty of care, should I inform BLM as well? Melanie, are you available to help me answer this question? Tanner or Shayla? I believe I have the answer, but I would like to get some assistance with this question. If not, we can come back to it. I'm wondering if, let's see, if perhaps, oh, I think I need to, I need to find Melanie. Okay, hold on one moment, everyone. Tanner, if you can, are you able to unmute?
Yes, I'm working on finding Melanie right now.
Thank you. Okay.
In the
Melanie is
147 people that are here. It's
is
great.
muted. I'm going to go to the next question. I have 2 written letters, made 2 unanswered phone calls, and sent 2 emails to the tribes which were present in the suspected area of the remains we have. We have no cultural items. The remains have been dated to 407. The exact locations are unknown, but thought to be. Okay, so okay, so this is relating to Native American human remains. Okay. Well, let's see. So when you are initiating consultation, you've identified based on, okay, so you have a location from Texas. So I'm assuming that that you identified federally recognized tribes in the area of the location of where the ancestors came from. So you initiated consultation. And it looks like you've called letters. I would advise you to continue to reach out to potentially culturally affiliated tribes, but you do have the museum or federal agency does have a requirement to continue to move through the process and publish a notice. And that notice can name culturally affiliated tribes. And so what you'll want to do is on the record keeping your consultation notes, you can keep a record of no response or if you do get a response and what happens and continue to move through. How do we proceed? Our contact with you goes back. We have requested NAGPRA to put our contact with you goes back over to, we have requested NAGPRA to put a notice in the Federal Register, but nothing was done. Okay, so what I'm wondering is, and this might be a question perhaps that you can send to our NAGPRA_info box so we can look up the particular notice that you have submitted. But once you continue through the process and submit a notice, we should have a record of that. So if, I don't know if Tanner or if you were able to get unmute Melanie would like to say anything less, but I might advise you to send us an info so I can answer the rest of this properly. Okay, let's see. Tanner, are there only the 2 questions? Does anyone else have any questions that I'm just not seeing? Let's see, unanswered questions. Okay, here we go. I found more. Okay, are joint claims under sacred objects and or cultural patrimony treated differently than joint claims for ancestors and AFOs? Hi, Ash. Are joint claims under sacred treated differently than joint claims for ancestors and AFOs? I don't quite, let's see. Tanner, can you help me with this one?
I don't think so. I'm gonna see if I can find a citation that maybe says otherwise, but my instinct tells me that it's just a joint claim either way. So let
Exactly.
me look.
That's how I would answer it as well. But Tanner again is going to try to find the language, and then Ash, if we can't find that language, please go ahead and send me an email, and we can definitely help you find that information. Oh, you can't. Let's see. You can vote these up. Most. Okay. Next question. I see the Congress intended in cases where there is no information, Native American traditional knowledge alone may identify a cultural item, phrase on NPS page presentations. Is that a nuance, a legal interpretation rooted in a court case, or someplace citable in or outside the regs? That is definitely a Melanie O'Brien question. I'm hoping she was unmuted.
Yeah, I'm here. Um, So that language is included in the regulations about Native American traditional knowledge. Alone, being able to identify cultural items. I take that back. I think that language is about cultural affiliation, where it says that one type of information may be used to determine cultural affiliation when no other relevant information is available. That's in 10.3A2, and would include that Native American traditional knowledge. I think to answer this question, I really need to think a little bit more about where we have this phrased. I think that this gets to, it definitely gets to the definitions of cultural items in the revised regulations. That includes Native American traditional knowledge. So now I've got it. Yes, there is a citation for this, and it comes from the congressional record, and it is in what Kate described as the preamble to the final rule. So let me go pull that up, and I'll be able to give you the exact paragraph in where that citation is. It's something to the, I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it's something to the effect of Congress intended that there would be great differences among tribes in terms of what were cultural items and how to identify those cultural items. And so the definitions are intended to allow for that great variability. And that's a sort of rough summary of what's in the congressional record. But let me go find that citation, and I'll add it into the Q&A.
Thank you. I think I went out of order for the questions, but I'm going to answer this one that asks, can you discuss the right of possession definition a little bit? I want to be sure I'm understanding it correctly. So I am literally looking at the definition right now. It is in 10.2 definitions, so I would recommend that you go and read this for sure. But possession or control, the right of possession definition. Okay, right of possession, excuse me, not possession or control. Right of possession means possession or control obtained with the voluntary consent of a person or group that has authority to alienation. Right of possession is given through the original acquisition of unassociated funerary objects, so cultural items, or human remains and associated funerary objects. And so right of possession is stating that, that the museum or institution has a right to, for lack of a better term, own that item, or has the legal authority to oversee, restrict use, to basically manage that item. And so right of possession, there are lots of details, and we've given details in other webinars about this, of asserting right of possession. And so if a request comes in, the museum must respond to that request, whether yes, they're going to repatriate, no, they're not going to repatriate, or they are asserting a right of possession, but they are going to repatriate anyway. And so a right of possession, so let's say that we use the pipe example all the time, that a museum has a pipe that was given from a Native American person to a doctor as a form of payment, and that pipe ended up in the museum, and that pipe was given to the doctor under duress, so it would be very difficult for that museum to assert they had a right of possession, and because that pipe never should have been alienated. So I hope that helps right of possession. We did discuss that. I did discuss right of possession in one of the webinars in the fall, but I urge you to go look at the definitions of right of possession, possession or control, and custody. And if you still have questions, please send us an email. Let's see, I'm going to go to the next. Instead of every institution doing cultural affiliation research, does National NAGPRA have or plan to make maps and lists, for lack of a better word, archaeological cultures, and indicating which nations have cultural affiliation? Well, we have a lot of resources on our website that can help guide you as to who you need to consult with and which tribes. So you can start and you can include geographic location. So there are lots of ways of finding this information. There are lists of tribes that are located within each state. There are THPOs, the Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, that can help guide you with consultation. You can use the geographical location of where the items or ancestors are physically located. If you have no additional information and your collections are in a specific state, then you can locate the tribes in that state to start the process. So we've provided a lot of information, but that isn't something that we create and then keep track of. But again, these are great questions. You can send us an email. It's really helpful if you join the NAGPRA Community of Practice, or reach out to the Association on American Indian Affairs, because I think that there are a lot of people here that can help guide you. But that's what I would advise you, is that there are a lot of ways that you can start to figure out who to culturally affiliate with. California has a long a list so if you're in California, it's easy to use. Okay. You stated that consultation must be completed to determine cultural affiliation, but don't we need to assess cultural affiliation to some extent to begin consultation? Okay, that's a great question. So when you're talking about a summary, you do need to know enough about your collections to know which tribes to initiate consultation with. And so if you have collections from 10 states, then you will identify the federally recognized tribes or NHOs, that are potentially culturally affiliated in those states. If a summary is a little bit different, we never recommend sending out letters to initiate consultation to all 574 recognized tribes, because that gets very burdensome for everyone when you have ancestors and human remains. For ancestors and associated funerary objects. For cultural items, it does sometimes require that the museum or institution reach out to all federally recognized tribes. And that is where understanding your collection will help narrow that down. So it's not common that we would ever advise, and I mean, a museum needs to make this decision themselves, but most of the time there's enough information to start with finding who to consult with. So a summary, you create your summary, you identify tribes, you initiate consultation, and then you consult. Now, for human remains and associated funerary objects, you do need to have an idea, again, of who to initiate consultation with based on the information that you have of who could be potentially culturally affiliated. So the wording is a little different. So then you reach out, you consult, and during consultation, it will be determined who has cultural affiliation to those human remains and associated funerary objects. I hope that helped answer your question. Okay, again, I am having trouble about the order, and I don't know if we're at Tanner or Shayla, if you're able to go in and somehow acknowledge that I've answered these. If you can remember, maybe we'll do a thumbs up. I'll have to work on the Q&A piece, but I'm going to continue down the questions. We have a legacy collection of excavated artifacts that is not huge compared to many institutions, but large and poorly documented. Okay, let's see. Poorly documented enough to be a major undertaking to determine what we have. Excavated artifact, not a huge, okay. I assume we should submit a short summary for the whole collection. We are working through the NAGPRA process already for the ancestors and funerary objects. We have no staff dedicated to this. I am working on this in my spare time between tasks. It's part of my actual duties. We are currently applying for a couple of collections/curation grants, including NEH, to help start getting a handle on this collection, and will include money for Indigenous consultation within the grant request. I guess I really don't have a question, just checking that this is a reasonable way to handle a legacy archaeological collection. This is a great question, and one we get often. So yes, so I would, if the museum assumes that they have or has a collection that may contain Native American cultural items, then you go ahead and compile that summary. If you're already working through the NAGPRA process on ancestors and funerary items, that's great, because You may have already identified some of the tribes that you need to reach out with to consult, tribes and NHOs. And even if you don't have a lot of information, summaries were meant to have been completed in 1993. And so I know here we are all these years later. And so it sounds like that you're going through the process. Just continue, go ahead and get that summary submitted as soon as you can, and initiate consultation so that tribes know that you have this, this legacy collection. And you don't need to wait, and I wouldn't advise you to wait until you get grant money, because again, you can submit this, you can submit a paragraph in an afternoon, devote one day focused on the information that you have. And honestly, you've written a lot of information here in this that could be very helpful to tribes. It's a legacy collection. Perhaps you can list some of the types of items you have. Perhaps you know who the person was who collected the collection or who amassed the collection. All of that can help expedite this, but I would expeditiously complete that summary. Okay, I'm thinking that might be the last question.
There's a couple more upon refreshing. I answered one of them. The other one is, will this year's documentation grants be posted soon on grants.gov?
We don't have any information right now on the grants information, but as soon as we have information, we will relay that to all of you. If you have questions specifically about grants, you can send those questions to us and I will get them to our grants coordinator. Thank you, Tanner. So let's see, we're getting close to the hour. We do have an hour and a half for these webinars. We don't have to take all the time, but I definitely recommend putting any questions in the chat, because I know that these are all helpful for people that are listening. A lot of people probably have the same questions. Is there anything that that someone needs more clarification on anything I talked about today? So somebody raised their hand. Would you be able to write your question? And you know, I will give it some thought in future webinars to actually open up the Q&A to live. We haven't done that in the past, but that is something I've been thinking about. So let's see, for the hand that is raised, which if you could today jot that down quickly in a quick written, that would be great. Tanner, do we have any, am I missing any?
Yeah, go ahead, close the Q&A and then reopen it. See if that'll display them for you.
Ah, okay. Oh, here we go. Thank you. I thought I had learned all the tips and tricks about Teams webinars, but I missed something. Is there any friction between gender-based duty of care requests from tribes and Title IX compliance? That's a really great question, and it's one that I cannot answer here because I'm not, I know what Title IX is, but I'm not familiar with it in this context. I don't know, Melanie, if that's something you can answer.
Yeah, I think that there could be friction, obviously, and that's where the regulations require that you accommodate requests to the extent possible. I think it's the language and duty of care. But there may be, it's make a reasonable and good faith effort to incorporate and accommodate the requests. But there may be requests that you cannot accommodate. One of the comments and responses speaks directly to that in the final rule. I think it's comment 12, but let me see if I can find it for you. We give an example of exactly this instance. Doesn't reference Title IX, but the idea that a museum may not be able to accommodate those requests.
Thank you, Melanie. And actually, if you could stay on a moment, I have another question I'm going to turn over to you. We have started declining unprovenanced ancestral Puebloan collections. These donors have asked what they should do with these items. Any recommendations?
Well, this is a tricky thing because by the museum or whoever declining to accept the collections, that puts those collections at some risk, certainly. And so finding a place that is willing to accept those collections is ideal. In many cases, that might be the state museum if you know that those collections come from a specific state. Seeking out support through the state museum for those collections might be a good option. Alternately, of course, the individual donors could proceed with a private repatriation outside of NAGPRA if they would like to. But again, that's going to be dependent on the tribes that are connected to those collections and whether they have the capacity to accept or engage in a private repatriation. So again, it's a difficult thing, and I think the key here is to whatever extent you can to try to find a way to protect those collections, because the last thing that you would want to happen is for those donors to dispose of the collections in some way that's not appropriate. So I guess that's the extent of our advice.
Thank you. If a museum submitted an item-by-item inventory of cultural items to satisfy the Section 6 summary requirement in 1993, how would they go about updating their summary data for holdings accessions since then? Well, so if the items that have been recently accessioned since then do not or cannot, because an item-by-item summary was submitted and therefore these new items can't be encompassed as part of that original summary, then there's that 6-month deadline that would fall onto the museum or institution to send a new summary. And then we, I believe, I could be speaking incorrectly, but I believe in the background, we then keep both of those and connect those together so that we have that information about multiple summaries. And that is one of the reasons why we recommend and why a summary is not an item by item, so that if you capture your collection well, then you won't ever need to update that, or excuse me, submit a new summary with newly accessioned items. Now there are museums and institutions that do accession in items regardless of how general their summary is. That's going to require a new summary, and that's okay. But in this case, I would suggest that because you had a line by line and these new accessioned in items have nothing to do with that and are very different, and then you would go through the summary process. You would submit a summary, initiate consultation, and let tribes know what items you have. Okay, let's see. What if an NIC, a notice of what if? Okay, what if an NIC, a notice of inventory completion, was submitted and posted in the 1990s, but was not claimed by any of the groups? Also, some tribes should have been included in consultation, but were not. Some were not federally recognized. Should consultation begin again and then submit a revised NIR? I'm thinking NIC, that should be include other groups. So thank you for this question. This, as many of you on the call today probably remember this question in the recent community of practice call. Melanie, I'm going to ask you if you could come in and offer some information on this. That I feel like I can answer part of it, but I would love it if you could jump in. So some tribes should have been included in consultation. Okay, so you have a published NIC and you have additional tribes that were not included. Well, actually, Melanie, I'm going to let you take this one to make sure it's answered correctly from the beginning.
I'm sorry, Kate, I'm not able to find it. This is, I can't really.
You want me to read the question?
No, I need to read it for myself. Who asked it? That might help me be able to find it.
Dawn.
Okay.
Dawn Cher Tomei. And I can try to put it to the top if you'd like.
No, I found it.
Okay.
So while Melanie's reading that, I went and checked one of the older threads, or the ones closer to the bottom, just to see if there are any more questions sprinkled in. There's one that says, you stated that consultation must be completed to determine cultural affiliation, but don't we need to assess cultural affiliation to some extent to begin consultation? I think the way I would answer that is your initial, I think assessing cultural affiliation to some extent is kind of overcomplicating the initial part. I think initially that assessment is just trying to figure out who to talk to, which tribe should you be communicating with, and whether that is geographical in nature or some notes that you have in the collection, that those give you the direction on where to go. That's not necessarily assessing cultural affiliation. That really goes down in consultation and in the weeds of that.
Would you like me to answer, Kate, the
Yes,
other
thank you.
question? For Native American human remains and associated funerary objects, after a notice is published, there is no obligation for a museum to conduct additional consultation or take any other action after that notice is published beyond receiving and considering requests for repatriation. So that's, I want to say, step 6. So once the notice is published, that's where the process stops until the tribes decide to make a request for repatriation. Now, can a museum do more? Absolutely. Can a museum proactively reach out to the tribes listed in the notice? Yes. Could they reach out to other tribes, as you indicate, maybe that have been newly recognized since then? Yes. Should consultation begin again? No. However, you can certainly communicate with any tribes about the ancestors in that notice. There is no additional notice requirement. I want to be very clear that there's no need to submit a revised NIC to include those other groups. If the other groups choose to make a request for repatriation, so somebody that's not listed in the notice decides to make a request for repatriation, you can receive and evaluate that request for repatriation from a group not named in a notice. That is an option at all times. And you can decide to repatriate to that group that's not identified in the notice, provided they are federally recognized. You could go ahead and submit a repatriation statement based on that request for repatriation.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Is there a way to check whether my institution did submit a summary already, perhaps 30 years ago? Yes, absolutely. If you would like to send us an email to the NAGPRA_info@nps.gov and make that request, we can send you the information.
Actually, Kate, they could do it themselves on the database page.
Yes, thank you. So the database page is one of the information I shared earlier on resources. So, and I give you the location of where it is, but if you go ahead and look at that database, then that will provide you that information. Okay, after a request for repatriation is made and the repatriation statement is made, how long do you have to wait to turn the remains over to make sure no one else makes a request first? So once a repatriation statement has been submitted, then those ancestral human remains are now in the possession or control of the tribe who made the request. Up until a repatriation statement is submitted, any tribe or NHO can make a request as well, which will need to be evaluated and was probably similar and might become a competing request or could be a joint request. But how long, so if you do have a repatriation statement, how long to wait to turn over, that is at the discretion for the museum and the tribe or NHO to determine physical transfer. Because remember, repatriation does not necessarily mean physical transfer. And perhaps the tribe or NHO who now has possession or control with the repatriation statement is not ready to receive those ancestors, perhaps they're not ready to rebury. And so they could work into an agreement with the museum, and there's nothing in the law that prohibits that, and that is not part of NAGPRA at that point. But once that repatriation statement is sent, then there aren't any other requests. Okay. Okay. There was a question that came in that I did not read because it wasn't complete. And now there's the second part of the question, and I'm wondering if I should just read the second part of the question. Well, I'm going to read the second part of the question because that's what's in front of me. And then apologies, I can go back and look for the first part. This one. All right, we have worked with a team of bioarchaeologists to do our best to determine ancestry based on the results of analysis along with the sparse associated documentation. We made a category of Native American, presumed Native American to cover our bases. We have 29 individuals. For 13, we have at least a state they came from, and we've identified our first list of tribes that claim the state as ancestral territory. That leaves 16 that we have no documentation and may or may not be Native American, but like I stated, we hedged our bets by using the presumed native category. What should we do with regard to the 16 sets of remains that we have no way of establishing a tentative cultural affiliation? For those 16 sets of remains, can we work with the tribes that claim our state as ancestral territory? Also, if we have groups that are not federally recognized and have been called out as not actually being of indigenous ancestry by federal tribes, do we have any obligation to work with these non-recognized groups? Okay. There's a lot to unpack in this question, but I think I can simplify this for you. And Melanie, if you need to jump in, or Tanner, or Shayla. So when under NAGPRA, under the regulations, human remains, and I should probably read it, but means that they are Native American. So it sounds like that the 16 you have presumed them to be, that you had enough information to presume that they are Native American. So once you've done that, if you presume that they're Native American, then you can include them on your itemized list and consult with tribes that you're consulting with about these unknown individuals. If they're part of a teaching collection, that might be all that you have, but working with the tribes where the collections are housed could at least give you helpful information. Some Native nations and communities will repatriate Native American individuals with unknown information, others won't, so it will be a conversation that you have. But part of the requirement for the museum or institution is to determine if they are Native American human remains. So in terms of the non-federally recognized tribes, so under NAGPRA, you are required to consult with federally recognized tribes. During consultation, you may ask, if you have non-federally recognized tribes, you may ask the federal tribes if they would like to work with non-federally recognized tribes. It is also at the discretion of the museum or institution. But under NAGPRA, you do need to work with the federally recognized tribes. There are ways that those ancestors can be returned. The federally recognized tribe could turn them over to a non-federally recognized tribe after repatriation. But I hope that's answered your question. If you have additional questions based on this topic, then please send those to us. But I just want to kind of reiterate that the time it took to work with a team of bioarchaeologists to determine ancestry. So that's we get asked this a lot. So on the one hand, you don't want to do research or access to Native American human remains without consulting with tribes. but you also have to determine if the human remains you have are Native American. And so that is at the discretion of the museum or institution. Melanie, did you want to add anything? If you don't unmute, I will assume not. Okay. The first part of my question tells why we had to do the bioarc work. Okay. I answered that question. It gets a little tricky. I think, under the regulations, I did just state what is required under the regulations. But I also mentioned that osteological documentation or work from a bioarchaeologist is not necessary, that you can utilize the information that you have available. And so if people have additional questions on this, I can answer. I might turn this over to Melanie to get into some more detail, but I think I'll leave it at that for now. Let's see, going off the last question scenario, we have a claim for ancestors and their belongings from a tribal nation before an NIC gets published, and that tribal nation is the only one included in the NIC. Would you be able to walk through timelines and products that need to be created and provided to tribal nations and National NAGPRA for steps 7 and 8? I have received some questions on interpreting these steps in the past. Okay, well, guess what I'm doing? I'm going to my regulations. So even, so this is where I really recommend, let's see, to try it. So, okay, so step 7 is receive and respond to a request for repatriation. So no earlier than 30 days after publication of that notice. So before a notice gets published, okay, timeline. So no earlier than 30 days after publication of a notice, but no later than 90 days after receiving a request for repatriation, a museum or federal agency must send a written response to the requester with a copy to any other party identified in the notice. So it sounds like there's one tribe. So you would send, you would have 90 days, no later than 90 days to send a response to that request. And in that response, you would indicate whether it satisfied the criteria or did not satisfy the criteria. And then at any time before sending a repatriation statement, you can receive additional requests. Then, no later than 90 days after responding to a request that meets the criteria, a museum or federal agency must send a written determination statement to the requester and a copy to National NAGPRA. So National NAGPRA will then receive a copy of that repatriation statement. But we do not get a copy. Let's see, handy dandy. Hold on one moment. Let me just double check one thing. So National NAGPRA does not get a copy at step 7. We get a copy at step 8. Now, if there's a competing request, there's additional requirements for when you would submit information to National NAGPRA. So Jasmine, I hope that answers your question. If not, please ask more, or you can send us a message and I can try to answer more. Okay, after a request for repatriation is made and a repatriation statement is, oh, I already answered this one, excuse me. Okay, let's see, I'm going to sort. Okay, I think I might have answered all the questions. Tanner, do you see any others? Let's see, if I missed one, please put it in the chat. Or excuse me, please put it in the Q&A. I have not, the chat function is disabled. Okay, I do believe that is all. We've answered all the questions. If anyone, I'll wait another minute or so to see if we have any additional questions, and if not, I'll go ahead and end the webinar. Okay, well, I would like to thank all of you for spending your time with me today during this webinar. And I really appreciate all of the questions. It does help. It helps a lot in terms of coming up with other trainings and webinar topics. As always, if you have specific questions or topics in mind, you can always send those to us. But I am trying to, oh, and also if you have other people that you would like to get that you think could utilize the NAGPRA webinars, please feel free to always send that information out. And we are always here to answer questions and help walk you through the process. So I just looked one last time. I don't see any new Q&A. So I'm going to say goodbye to you all today. Thank you so much for joining us.